All right, I think we are live. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're watching from. My name is Sara Bloom. I am the Executive Director for Downtown Hays Development Corporation in Hays, Kansas, as well as Board Secretary for ITGA. I have had the pleasure of getting to moderate these ITGA Town Gown Turnaround Series webinars, and we've had a wide variety of these. We've had some networking opportunities. We've had some great discussion and some actual learning opportunities. But at the last networking opportunity, if you were able to join us 2 months ago, actually, we had some great questions about how to evaluate or analyze or measure, whatever words you want to use, your town gown relationships where you are. And so we wanted to dive in deeper. If that was really something that our ITGA members wanted to learn about, we wanted to do that for you. And so we have put together a wonderful, wonderful panel of experts this morning to talk about some different tools or ways that they are analyzing those relationships. And then we're going to dive in even further. You'll hear at the end that we're going to continue this series for at least one more, if not 3 more months. But I'm very excited to introduce you all to our panelists this morning, and I will not do them justice. So I'm going to go ahead and let them jump in. We only have an hour and we have a lot to discuss. So we're going to kick off this morning with Kristen Norris from Indiana University, and she's going to be talking about collaboratory.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, Kristen Norris. I've been at IU for 14 years. My background is in higher education administration, and I study the public mission of higher education. So lots of work around community engagement and how we think about partnerships. And I can kick us off with, Sarah, are you advancing our slides for us? Yes.
Yes, I am.
Do you want to do all introductions first, though, I assume?
Yes, that would be great. So Kristen will kick us off. Sharon, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, good day. It's Sharon Leggett with the University of Georgia Archway Partnership here in Athens, Georgia.
Also with Archway, we'll go to Sam next.
Yes, thank you, Sarah. I'm Sam Perren with the University of Georgia Archway Partnership, and I'm based in Thompson, McDuffie County, which is a small town about an hour and a half outside Athens.
All right, and last but not least, Stephen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Steve Gavazzi. This is my 30th year at The Ohio State University, and I'm a professor in the College of Education and Human Ecology.
Very good. Well, thank you all for being here this morning. We appreciate it. I know that a lot of prep work has gone into this, and we're not done yet, but let's dive right in. Kristen, tell us about collaboratory.
I think that IUPUI and its history, I say IUPUI sometimes instead of IU, and that's mostly that most of my work started at IUPUI, but my position now is across the IU system. For those of you who don't know, we have 7 campuses. So trying to understand all of IU's partnerships in and with others is quite the heavy task, I would say. And I'll just provide a little bit of context for why we track partnerships the way that we do. What was our motivating factors for better understanding this work? And I've been at the university for a really long time. I would say the majority of my work rooted in service learning. So course-based experiences that had a specific type of community partners as co-educators. And we got really, really good at creating tags for courses, and then on an annual basis, asking faculty who we knew had those tags, who they partnered with. And it was really a good, I say we were really good at bean counting. I got really good at what I say, capturing the fabulous 5 numbers. I use fabulous in a bit of a derogatory term sometimes, but 5 refers to the number of courses. I would say community engaged learning courses, or community-based learning courses, not just service learning. The number of faculty who taught those, the number of students who participated in those experiences, the number of community partners that we engaged as part of the process, and the number of service hours students completed as part of that. Service hours, I would say, rooted in the Presidential Higher Honor Roll, which no longer exists, but is an interesting metric to try to understand the impacts of our engagement, because it's the one thing we can quantify, as my colleagues can talk about later on. But in the process of understanding or counting the beans and getting very good at the beans, people just kept asking me other questions about, like, well, what are we doing to address K through 12 education? Or what are we doing to look at race relations in our community? And there was, what did you want me to search? Like a keyword search of community partner names or the title of the course, which, by the way, the title of a course doesn't necessarily indicate what social issue you would be examining. And so it became imperative to our institution that collecting information from faculty through annual reports was certainly a big battle, but that when we wanted to better understand our partnerships and examine them, the current methods and processes that we were using didn't allow us to answer the questions that we wanted to be asking. These top 10 reasons to systematically, and I use the word systematically very intentionally. I've seen it, when I say systematically, I would say a unified strategy across the institution. And that's not always been the same. I would say certain offices that manage, say, service learning courses captured information differently than the research office, which was different than government relations. We were never, prior to this, all sort of using the same sheet of music to better understand our engagements. Or if we were, if you want to consider faculty and reports to be that, I can name lots of people who do engagement that don't complete a faculty and report. And I know lots of faculty who do a lot of engagement that don't include those types of engagements in their faculty and reports because it's not valued across the institution, or they don't think it's as important for what that purpose of that data collection method is. So when I say understanding the full scope of our engagement, again, that link is a great document by Emily Yankee and Barbara Holland in 2013 about why data matters. And they go into some of these examples that I'll mention here. But so when I say the full scope of engagement, I don't just mean teaching and research or just outreach. Every event, you host an exhibit that discusses or helps people think about the history of your community is important, but never usually documented somewhere. Number 2 is being clarifying goals. So community engagement for us is a strategy through which we achieve our goals. And as a strategy, it's about the process. So we think about how do we align our engagement to achieve the goals of our institution and the goals of our communities. Assessing outcomes, thinking about student development of civic mindedness, looking at quality of life plans, faculty recognition and reward through promotion and tenure processes are the outcomes we think about there. To craft plans, we try to think about data-informed decision-making historically, and I would say to a larger extent currently. The left hand, there's lots of people doing engagement, but the left hand and the right hand don't know what the left hand and the right hand are doing. There are faculty sitting next to each other. I've literally left one faculty member's office, gone into the person next door. They're both working similarly projects or similar partners and don't know, and they'll be like, I'm the only one who does this. So even in their own units and in their own departments, there's not a shared understanding. And so the university has never been able to really craft plans at a systematic level prior to this thinking. Improve teaching, research, and service. We think of scholarship of teaching and learning as one aspect of this work. I would highlight that IUPUI just updated its promotion and tenure guidelines for diversity and inclusion as a metric for promotion and tenure. And there was a press release you can read inside Higher Ed and you'll find it, but I can share a link to that also in the chat if others are interested, that they're calling it an integrated case, that their engagement is integrated across their teaching, their research, and their service. And how do we sort of evaluate that work? Identifying opportunities for collaborating and learning. It's about convening people and making sure you have the right people at the table. I've done a lot of work in my time over collecting stories, whether that's because we're going to have a legislator that someone needs to go talk to, or a stakeholder in the community, a superintendent, and how do we really understand what it is that we're doing with those groups of people. Conveying the scope and the range. I guess I feel like I have been overwhelmed by there's so much going on at our institution. At this point, I just don't want us to make fools of ourselves in the community when the university goes out into it. That's a fairly low level stake benchmark to hold, but in many ways, there's so much going on that actually is a realistic benchmark for us. Recruitment and retaining students and faculty and staff. IUPUI changing its promotion and tenure guidelines, but we use collaboratory actually at IUPUI to include a link to a school's profile within there and a faculty member. We've put it into job applications. So as they recruit faculty, they could see how their engagement and how their teaching and their research could be integrated into existing projects at the university. I think about recruiting students as well. We have a growing interest of population of students who are interested in how their work at the university and their time at the university can make a difference around a specific social issue. Sustainable development goals is one of those aspects that we look at. And yeah, so we can track all of those things by that as well. And then just lastly, I think it's about strengthening our capacity and our, we may say reputation in the university, but it's really about town-gown partnerships. And what is our capacity? Being realistic about what is the university's capacity to work with our partners, and what else do we need to understand about who we are, where we are, and why we are there in a systematic way. So I wanted to give that as a sort of framework for why we should all be thinking about this. I'm sure all of you could agree to those top 10 things. If you're not saying yes, this is why we're wondering how we do this work, at least some of those may have resonated with you. What I would try to articulate then today with collaboratory and our thinking is that it's historically been externally driven and traditionally ad hoc requests of information. Yeah, so you can go to that second slide that you were just on, one more. Yeah, there you go. Satisfying a needs in the moment of time. I have literally been responsible for tracking and counting beans because there was an annual report that I had to produce by August 1st of every year. I don't know who read that report to make informed decisions, but it had to justify our existence of how much money we spent and what that contributed to. And the ideal is that you're internally driven, that you understand where you are in relation to your goals. And Stephen would say it's about doing temperature checks along the way. How do we think about building our capacity to advance the work, improve the work, and make informed decisions? I think that's a fundamental shift for most of our institutions at this time, is trying to move away from the traditional, I'm doing this because someone expects me to deliver reports, versus what do we really need to know to make good processes and decisions. To illustrate this, we have a very short article and assessment update where we've talked about systematically collecting information. I would say universities, so let me back up and say collaboratory does this job of who does what, where, with whom, and for what purpose. And universities on the right-hand side are pretty darn good at breaking things down by courses. And, you know, if you think about your registrar system, your SIS system, your center's database or an Excel spreadsheet, but how that is related to community most of the time, if you'll go to the next slide for me, Sarah, most of the time when we capture information about that, there's a connection between a course and oftentimes a community partner agency, maybe within a geographic region. And what we're trying to do is collaborate by using collaboratory. I think I have one more really good slide that shows all the lines. Yes, sorry, the original one is the black line. But if we keep moving forward, keep advancing, unfortunately, it's not going to all pop up at once. The goal is to get all of these red lines to appear. That the black line is the first one that we always do, but that at the end of the day, the goal is to be able to make all of the connections. So it'd be a shift in changing I'm tracking a community-based learning course that's addressing a policy issue. And what's that policy issue? Or what population are the students working with? Not just the community partner, because the partner address in and of itself sometimes doesn't even recognize what population or geography your students are serving. My students could be working with United Way, which serves a ton of agencies and organizations, or they could be working with Keep Indianapolis Beautiful, which is an environmental group. That address of Keep Indianapolis Beautiful is not where the students were planting trees or cleaning up parks. And so if we aren't systematically thinking about who's doing what where and building these connections between our institutions and our community and tracking those engagements and those relationships, we hadn't, prior to what we use collaboratory to do, track all of those engagements. So that was sort of a sort of preview into what we're thinking about. And I think that the rest of us can all sort of open this up for a bit of a panel discussion. I can talk very briefly and timing wise about what I think some of you might want to know what collaboratory is. So I did offer a few slides that just briefly goes into that, and I'll kick that off right now. And then I know that Stephen and my colleagues are going to talk about what they do as well.
I think it would be great. If you have any questions, of course, I did not mention this at the start of the webinar, but if you have any questions, please put that in the Q&A. We already do have a question. Any of our panelists, feel free to answer. This is from Kristen Young. How do you classify town gown partnerships outside of service learning? And what do you think is the best way to nurture those partnerships?
Actually, go to the next slide for collaboratory and I'll tell you what I classify as. It's a good question. Perfect. Lead in there. So if everything that you see in that is what IU is capturing in collaboratory. So I have two key questions. I don't sort of categorize it by a type of activity. Instead, if you can name a population, a community partner, an agency, an organization, or an individual, and does it contribute to improving society? I think we should all be capturing. So if you can just answer yes to those two questions, I don't care if it's courses, research, an outreach program, an initiative, a sustained initiative, a thing you do on an ongoing basis, an event, a backpack attack drive, an ongoing tutoring and mentoring program. We would say that you should try striving to. I think it's impossible to capture everything, but that's the goal. I was trying to see the chat at the same time. Were there any other messages in the chat? It's hard for me to see them. Okay.
Any other panelists want to speak to what Kristen has presented or answer that question?
Sure, I'll take a stab at that. I think it's a great question. And the way that I see it is that the activities, whether it's service learning or otherwise, is less important than who's getting connected to who. And so one of the things, and I'll be talking a bit more about this in terms of what the optimal college town assessment does, but I think it's important to be able to aggregate information and talk about overall town gown relationships, but it is vitally important to be able to disaggregate that data and be able to say, how is it, as a for instance, that students are being connected to members of the business community versus social service agencies versus clergy. So I think that that's a really important aspect. The service learning piece, it would be important to people who are trying to measure service learning, and you might want to capture that kind of information. But honestly, at the end of the day, in terms of assessing those relationships, I think the activities are less important than who's being connected.
Yes, completely agree.
Yeah, and I'll add, Kristen, I really like that approach and that idea of striving to track it all, having that as I really like that approach. And I think something y'all both hit on is that, our community partners are not going to, they might not know that it's a service learning course that's helping them with some initiative, or that it's a faculty research project or whatever the case. They just know they're getting help, and so that they are interested in that information in sort of a different way than our friends on campus are. I think this approach really is helpful for both of those.
Got another question for you all. How do you ensure, this is actually probably more for Kristen, how do you ensure your campus partners are entering data into Collaboratory?
You probably go to my next slide. You guys are like queuing this up so well. Actually go, maybe not that one, but I'll jump into it for the first moment. So technically community partners do not enter anything into Collaboratory. The people that can enter information and activities into Collaboratory are faculty, staff, and technically students who proxy information on behalf of faculty. So, and here's how community partners, so it's an interesting dynamic. The developers of Collaboratory originally, when they were thinking, this was developed out of University of North Carolina, Greensboro, the community partners at the time, and I'm not saying that this has changed, didn't want yet another system that they had to then provide back to the university. And so they didn't want to log into something. They didn't want to be a part of it. So they wanted to be notified if they were being recognized or acknowledged or their roles being mentioned, but they didn't want to be having to enter any information into it. And so when I name a community partner, or when I tag a community partner in Collaboratory with an activity, I have the ability to name, like type in that person's name and email address. It's an optional field. So if I, as a faculty or staff member, want to make sure that that community partner knows that we are adding this information into the system. They get an email notification from Collaboratory that says Kristen Norris has just contributed your Healthy Communities activity to Collaboratory, and there's a link to it, and they can click on it and see it, but they don't have to take any action on it, if that makes sense. We have some other university campuses, though, that are using it to talk to their community partners and convene their community partners to have more dialogue. We've found that a lot of the community partners also do not know what the other community partners that they work with on similar issues are doing. And there are some communities who are using Collaboratory. Both the community partner could use, community partners could have a license of Collaboratory as well as institutions. So there are ways which communities can come together and be, Collaboratory allows us to affiliate ourselves to each other. So for example, each IU campus has a URL for Collaboratory, its own unique portal, but I told Collaboratory to connect me to all of the IU campuses. And so they're all, when I am working with, for example, a faculty member or a different community part, if IUPUI is working with a community partner, I can also see that Bloomington is working with the same community partner. Or if I'm working with an IUPUI faculty member is working with a faculty member in Bloomington, those two things can be connected because we've told our systems to share data, or we've told our portals to share data across them. I can go through other questions. I can talk about how we're using our data. Actually, Sarah, I'll skip over that because we'll get into it for a second. Would you? So we're using it to map our engagement. So we pull data out of Collaboratory as an automatic lat long, and we can map things. We can jump around between these slides, but go to the next one really quickly. We use it to create story maps. We've done story maps on a geography, story maps on service learning, and story maps on what we're doing with a particular population, as well as social issues. Let's skip over that one for a second too. We highlight faculty and staff who all then have a profile in Collaboratory on our website. And when you click on Peter Altenberger, you see all of his projects, all of his partners, all of his courses, and faculty can all find each other that way too. Next one. I think this is one more over two. Sorry. I wanted to get into how Collaboratory works. So go with the activity, which is the one right. The proxy feature allows us to then leverage, as you see here, we're allowed to take information outside of all of those systems. So I get an IRB report. If there's a community engaged research, IRB tells me that it was community engaged research, and I can follow up with that faculty member, and we proxy that information on behalf of the faculty member. So not to duplicate any efforts. If a faculty member has already told you they do engagement somewhere else, even if it's just a press release, at least allows me to follow breadcrumbs and understand what we are doing and add it to Collaboratory. I'll back up one more. Can you back up one? Yes, right there. That one of the key factors that distinguishes Collaboratory from other databases is that the activity is the unique ID. If the name of the activity is the unit of analysis is another way to say that. Similarly, like in your university's HR system, your employee ID is your unique ID. In the SIS, it's a student ID. In the registrar's information, it's the section number of your course is a unique ID. But when you name the activity and make that the unit of analysis and the key identifier, you are able to then tag it by its partners, its funding sources, its courses, its social issues, its populations. That's an oversimplification of it, but it's a highly relational database on the back end. That's what I'll end with. I can talk more about use stuff in my slides, but I don't want to. Do I have a definition of an activity?
Yes.
If you're working with someone external to the campus that is addressing a specific population, Collaboratory considers that an activity. And that can be anything, right? A faculty member serves on a board of a school corporation. I didn't really think that was a big deal until COVID hit. And now that faculty member is making decisions about whether or not the school is open and whether they're in person. And it's a faculty member in nursing who happens to be on the board of the Washington Township Schools. An activity could be a 5-year research project. An activity could be a single day of service with 20 partners, community partners. An activity could be a capstone course project. So an activity tends to be If the simplest answer is if you can, if you're addressing a public priority and you can name an external organization, agency, or population, that's what it counts as an activity. And we can build all the other pieces from there. If it's connected to courses or research or which partners, all that kind of stuff.
Right. If you have more questions for Kristen, please put them in the Q&A. She will try to answer those. If we have time, we'll answer them live at the end, but I want to make sure that we have time for Stephen and Sam and Sharon to all speak. So let's go ahead and jump into Okta, which is Stephen Gavazzi's area.
All right, thanks again, Sarah, and thanks to ITGA and all of its members for this opportunity. And speaking of ITGA, the original conceptualization and the eventual operationalization of the optimal college town assessment was really a group effort. And I want to give a shout out to Mike Fox. Mike is one of the ITGA board of directors, and also former colleague, actually, of all of our Clemson friends, Jeff Martin, who retired a short while ago from Clemson University. So it was really the three of us coming up with this idea of how is it that you actually could begin to measure these campus community relationships that we all find to be important. So if you would advance the slide, Sarah. Oh my, this is a little bit harder to see, at least on my screen. There's 4 quadrants that actually come from both the conceptualization and the way that we actually measure these town-gown relationships. Where you want to be is that top right-hand corner, which is the harmonious relationship. And by the way, this actually all is based on marital research literature, which as someone who's now looked at these campus community relationships for over 10 years, and I am, by the way, a marriage and family therapist by training, I can't really discern many differences between marriages and town-gown relationships. They seem to function very much the same. Actually, the only difference, the only real difference is that in a town-gown relationship, you can't get a divorce. So the next best thing or next worst thing, I guess, to getting a divorce is being in the devitalized category, which I'll talk about in just a second. So this top right-hand corner is made up of both high effort and high comfort. And whether it's a marriage relationship or a campus community relationship, you have to have both partners putting in fairly significant amounts of energy or effort into the relationship in an ongoing manner. And at the same time, you also have to make sure that that energy or effort that you're putting into it is actually resulting in comfort, in higher satisfaction. So the optimal relationship is the harmonious, it's the combination of that. Everything else becomes suboptimal. The next best relationship is the traditional relationship. And just as in marriages, I'm not sure that there are many traditional relationships that exist in reality, because this is the particular combination of low effort but high comfort. Now, you typically will think about this kind of relationship in terms of being kind of separate but equal status, where the town and the gown, they respect each other, they look at each other, but they really don't have very many connections. And that's what really, I think, goes to the significance of this lower effort. Again, I think mostly because of student behavior issues and land use issues, it's very hard to imagine campuses and communities not having significant effort and significant activity that will impact that relationship. But nevertheless, it exists as a typology. The conflicted relationship is the one that everyone always gets concerned about. You're putting a lot of effort, and again, whether it's a marriage or a town-gown relationship, you're putting a lot of effort into this, but it's resulting in lots of conflict, lots of negative interactions. And then the worst of all is the devitalized. And this is the particular combination of low effort and low comfort. And this is really a bad place to be, right? Because you have both partners, they're in, especially in a town-gown relationship, you're stuck with one another, you can't get a divorce. And yet what you find is that there's this typically a long history of negative interactions that lead to a further deterioration in the comfort levels. So that's the conceptual model. And what we did is we set out to measure these relationships in a way that would match this conceptual model. So Sarah, if you could move to the next slide. Anyone can go to this site to check out the data collection tool itself, collegetownassessment.com. When we begin to work with you, what we do is we create a unique URL. We actually use your email suffix. So for instance, when we worked with Clemson, it was collegetownassessment.com/Clemson/survey. And so each one is unique. It creates that URL that will allow you to utilize the survey for as long as you would like to, or to use it repeatedly, which is what we're now suggesting that people who are using the Okta do, to basically rinse and repeat. You do an implementation of the survey, and then 6 to 9 months later, do the same thing again. We provide help for people with their data in terms of real-time data tracking. So as soon as someone completes a survey and pushes enter, it actually automatically populates your database. And there are built-in reports. So whether it's pie charts or histograms or other features that we've developed, the reporting is done for you. And so it really takes the burden off of folks, both in universities and communities. Usually universities have more resources to be able to analyze data, but we figured that one of the things that really prevents people from gathering data is deciding what to do with it. And so we provide all of the tools for people to be able to actually make that happen and make it work for them. So Sarah, if you go to the next slide. This is where Kristen gave me the lead in to talking about what Okta really does. We've never meant Okta to be a tool that would necessarily be generalized to the entire population of a campus and a community, but rather, as it says here, really we want it to be a snapshot of the health of the relationship. And so depending on the kinds of campus community relationships you have, what we do is we encourage people to get those subgroups to be involved in the collection of the data. And unlike what happens in collaboratory and going to the previous question that was asked, we actually do have community members who put data in. In fact, they're a very important part of putting the data in because they're describing their experiences both personally and also the reputation of the relationship. So members of the community are talking about both their personal experiences with faculty and staff and students and administrators, and in turn, they're also talking about what they see as the reputation of the university in terms of its connection with townspeople. And then vice versa, we do the same thing with campus folks. So we ask these faculty, staff, students, and administrators to talk about their connections with business leaders, with members of the clergy, with folks who are in social service agencies, and et cetera. And I think the most important thing that I can say here is that just like a person's body temperature, it's really important to see this from the standpoint of a developmental aspect so that these relationships are going to change over time. And so our hope is that people who get involved in the use of the Okta are actually looking to increase the strength or the positivity of those relationships. Here's a brief look at what the Okta actually looks like. This is what the survey looks like. You can see there's a progress tracking tool on the top. This is a particular question about overall contact that people have with groups of people. So this is actually the community version of this, and it's asking the community member, how much contact do you have with students, with faculty, with staff and administrators, and also with governing board members. So Sarah, if you would advance that. Here's just an example. This is actually Clemson's database. So the last time that they used this, it talks, it tells you very specifically, but on the right-hand side, how many complete and incomplete surveys you have at the moment. And then also it tracks over time. And you can see actually by this, tracking tool that when Clemson released its survey, it got a tremendous number of folks. It then died down, and then they did their first reminder and it went up. And then they did a second reminder before closing it out, and it again resulted in some significant participation among both campus and community members. Sarah, if you'd advance again. We use a mobilization cycle in terms of trying to situate data gathering. We think that there are things that campuses and communities need to do before they gather data, but also they need to be planning on doing certain things after. So this awareness raising and coalition building, this has a lot to do with laying the groundwork for the people that you're going to be surveying. And the interpreting information and evidence-based action has to do with what you're then telling people who've taken this survey, what you're actually going to do. And I won't go into any more detail about this now, but in 2 months, when I come back and do a much more comprehensive examination of this, I'll talk about some of the strategies that we actually use in each of these components of the mobilization cycle. So I think that pretty much rounds it out. Sarah, is there another slide? I may have one more slide in there. Yeah, so this is just a reminder then about how it is that when you're about to gather data for people in the community, you have to start thinking about who in the business community is going to be your contact. When we did this on the Ohio State Mansfield campus, where I used to be the dean and director, we went directly to our economic development board and our Chamber of Commerce. Likewise, we had a network of clergy that we went to. We went to the United Way in terms of our nonprofit agencies. We had gone directly to the school superintendents so that we made sure that local school district principals and teachers were represented in the database. And then for us, there were some other important stakeholders in the community, again, going back to business and economic development, because we actually had just opened up a business and industry scholarship program. And so we had some stakeholders that we wanted to make sure that we were tapping in to this. And then finally, in terms of the campus champions, it's the exact same way around. Are you going to your student government, for instance, to make sure that students are participating, the faculty senate, various different staff and administrative groups, and also, and I've written about this extensively, there really needs to be buy-in at the university leadership level. And I know Kristen can talk a lot more about that as well as other important stakeholders on the campus that may be very specific to your particular mobilization. And so that's it for me. So thanks, Sarah, appreciate that.
Yeah, I want to open it up to our panel. If you have any questions or comments for Stephen, we do have one in the chat for you, Stephen. 2 questions. Is there any cost to utilize this resource, and what will you do with the data that is collected?
So the cost is dependent on the group and what additional features they may want to use. So a lot of the cost ends up being the customization of what it is that people want in terms of specific questions that go beyond the things that we've built. But there is I think it's a scaled cost. I'm not the business end of this, and so I always am reluctant to not put my foot in my mouth. That has to do with the storage of your data and also the amount of time that you actually keep the survey open. In terms of the second question, what do you do with the data that's collected? We consider the data co-owned. So we own it from the standpoint of we put it into the growing database. At this point in time, there have been about 35 different campuses and communities that have utilized this tool. And so when you get your scores that tell you where you fall, as for instance, in the 4 quadrants of the tool, in terms of harmonious and traditional, conflicted, and devitalized, those are based actually on cut scores that we use that entire database to develop. And so that's an ongoing process that we have.
All right, Kristen, Sam, or Sharon, any comments for Stephen?
I would only sort of illustrate that I think the Okta and Collaboratory would complement each other extremely well, right? That I encourage, I've seen institutions in time for Carnegie classification for community engagement, perhaps, send information out to community partners or for an award application, like a one-time thing. And they're asking for such basic information about, like, how do we work with you? What's your satisfaction of working with the institution? But if you really want to get at this more meaningful stuff, that the relationship pieces, like Stephen's mentioning, that if you already knew what you were doing with them, you know, from a basic description of what your activity with that activities with those community partners look like, you would actually know who to invite to participate in Stephen's survey. And so sometimes we think of community, we name a community partner, and it could be a very large organization. So you survey their director, but the person that you're actually working with most closely is not the director. It's 5 other people in that organization. And so the people are so critical to this. And so, I just think that they are, and Steve and I both, kudos to each other all the time, right? That these two things could complement each other so well for understanding both what is the landscape of your engagement look like and how do you do a deep dive into understanding your relationships to them.
Very good. Thank you. I think that does it for questions. Again, if you have any more, please put those in the chat. We'll make sure we try and get to them. We will move on to Sam Perren with the Archway Partnership.
Thank you, Sarah. Excited to be here with you all this afternoon. Again, I'm Sam Perren with the University of Georgia Archway Partnership. Sarah, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the Archway Partnership is part of public service and outreach at the University of Georgia, and we connect Georgia communities with the resources of the university to help them address their locally identified community and economic development issues. So the way we do that is we have public service faculty members like myself who are based out in 8 communities out in the state. So my community is Thompson-McDuffie County, which is about an hour, 20 minutes or so southeast of Athens. It's sort of on the outer side of Augusta, Georgia, if you know where that is. But our furthest away communities are about 4.5 hours away in southwest Georgia. The town of Cairo, not Cairo, is our furthest community away. And so that's just a little bit of the basics of how we work. Let's go to the next slide. So the way this all plays out in our communities is we work with local stakeholders who tell us what their major issues are that they want to work on together over a period of several years. You can see kind of the main ones who tend to come here on the screen. It's things like economic development, leadership, education, quality of life, health and wellness. And for those priority areas, we put together what we call issue work groups, which are just groups of people in the community who care about the issue or who maybe have a certain expertise, who come to meetings typically about once a month. They come up with projects and goals and ideas on ways that they can move their community forward together. Then I call folks like Sharon back on campus who help connect us with students and faculty who have relevant expertise who can help the community accomplish its goals. So that's kind of the basics of how it works. We can go to the next slide. So I want to talk with you all a little bit today about our evaluation plan, which we've put together over the past few years. So I think there's some takeaways here that you might be able to adapt for other sorts of town jam partnerships at your institutions. So the major components of our evaluation plan, we have some student and faculty questionnaires. As I mentioned, the students are really kind of our workforce that helps our communities accomplish their goals. And so it's really important to us to understand the strength of the relationship we have with students. Are they getting something valuable out of this experience and working with our communities? We design it to be sort of an experiential learning opportunity for them to take what they're learning in class, put it to work out in the state. We want to understand those relationships. Same with the faculty that we work with. We want to make sure that we're providing them with a valuable opportunity to do research in a part of the state where they wouldn't have a connection otherwise. So we want to understand the strength of those relationships. The major things I'm going to talk to you about today, if we can go back real quick, we'll talk about project value and return on investment estimates. These are dollar values that we put on each of those projects that are completed in our communities to help our community partners understand sort of the return they're getting for their investment in working with us. We also use a tool called the Wilder Collaboration Factors Inventory, which is a free tool available from Wilder Research that enables collaborative groups to understand how they work together and how their dynamic as a collaborative group changes over time. And we also put together an index from secondary economic development data to help our communities understand how they're changing over time. We can go to the next slide. So a little overview here of the community benefit, how we're able to communicate to them that return on investment we were talking about. Over on the far left, you see the return on investment to all of our communities combined in fiscal year 2020. And where that number comes from, that is sort of an aggregation of every project that was completed in our communities. We use Bureau of Labor Statistics wage rates And we line those up with relevant occupation codes that line up with the student's degree program. We take the 25th percentile of those wage rates so that it's discounted as it's student work. And then we add those up and are able to demonstrate to our communities what they're getting in working with us. The other factors that go into that return on investment are the value of having that faculty member based in the community, any grants that we help the community receive while we're working together, and then we subtract the amount that they pay into the partnership to work with us. We have an annual memorandum of understanding with each of our communities that contributes about 1/3 of the cost of the overall partnership, with the university covering the remaining 2/3. And so it's really important to us to be able to demonstrate to both to our partners out in the state, as well as our partners on campus, the return that our communities are receiving from working with us. We can go to the next slide. The Wilder collaboration factors inventory I mentioned before, we started rolling out a few years ago in our communities. And so the long-term hope is to do sort of longitudinal surveys where every couple of years we survey the same community leaders to understand how their collaboration is changing and hopefully growing and improving over time. But what we have so far is sort of an example of where our different communities were as far as how many years they had been in the partnership working with us and when they took the survey. And so what you see is the trend that we had hoped for, that communities who've worked with us longer have learned how to work together a little better over time. And so that I think is sort of, we've heard people refer to it as the hidden benefit of this sort of partnership is, they get the benefit of the student work, the faculty work, the connections with the university. But in the process, community members also learn how to work together with each other a little bit better, which is an important thing for them to be learning and makes it more sustainable, for the long term. We can go to the next slide. So the Wilder collaboration factors inventory is based on 20 factors that are shown to be important in collaboration. Well, something interesting we found in rolling this out in our communities is that all of the communities we work with, even the first time they take this questionnaire, have 3 strengths that are in common. They all see collaboration as in their self-interest. They all think that their collaborative group has a unique purpose that matters. And they believe that the political and social climate is ripe for collaboration. So we see those almost as kind of prerequisites for working together. The last thing I want to show you here is a slide that shows the output from our economic development index that we put together. And again, this is nothing, that we had to go out and really collect new data. We took secondary data from the Census Bureau, from the Georgia Department of Labor, organizations like that, common economic development metrics like unemployment rate, median household income, housing vacancy rate, that sort of thing. Indexed them, and then show how our communities have changed along those indexed metrics from the first year that they started working with us. So in this case, Colquitt County was our first community. They came on board in 2005. That red line shows their economic development growth since 2005. That 112.8 demonstrates that their sort of overall economic development index has increased by 12.8% since they started with us. That gray line is the rural Georgia benchmark. So that's the rest of rural Georgia, how they did along those same economic metrics over that time. And this is not a situation where we say we're taking credit for that gap, but it's a point where we can help our communities understand how they've changed over time in a way that helps them inform those priorities that we talked about at the beginning, to better understand, how they're making progress in economic development and what new priorities they might want to tackle next. So that's sort of the basics of our evaluation plan. Look forward to opportunities to discuss it a little more later on this year.
Sharon, do you want to add anything?
Thanks, Sarah. Not really, Sam. Sam really covered it well. I think there are probably a couple points that make Archway different in that we do put faculty members out in these communities across the state. Unlike some other universities that have satellite campuses, these folks are really embedded in the community and really work with the community day in and day out to facilitate those conversations about partnerships and collaborations and leveraging resources, and really try and keep all the wheels on the car rolling in the same direction for these different projects. We do have students that come out into our communities for experiential learning opportunities, separate individually as classes, as service learning classes. We also have, as Sam mentioned, faculty who travel into our communities and work with communities on projects and initiatives. And then we don't just do the project and leave. That faculty person is there to help with resources day in and day out to help them implement the course that was that the community chose to tackle. So we're really proud of the work that we do in communities. We're really proud that the community brings us projects rather than the university looking at a community and say, oh, you have this really horrible indicator and we really think you should work on that. There really is an intentional practice of teaching community members how to partner and how to collaborate. And that goes on, as you can see, for a number of years. And I'm just really proud of our colleague Sam and the other faculty members that have worked for the last several years to come up with these sort of indicators and metrics to help us tell our story. Because as you know, we have all kinds of audiences, internal and external audience. So the more avenues we have to tell that story, I think the better positioned we all are.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sharon. We're running a little bit out of time. I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I'm going to give you all one final question, and I'm very excited to hear your answers. After hearing all of this, I think that I could use all three tools in my community. So is that necessary? Do I, in order to get the full story or the full picture of my town-gown relation, would I need to necessarily use all three of these tools? Or is there an ideal situation in each community or in each university that you feel your tools cater to best? I'll end with a really hard one. I think I stumped Chris.
Jump in from our perspective. You know, our plan is sort of customized and homemade in some ways to the specifics of our partnership. So I think the takeaway perhaps for other folks would be to not be afraid to do that with your situation. You know, find what makes your partnership unique, what you particularly want to measure about your collaboration between the university and the community. And, you know, if the tools we discussed can be helpful in that, I think that's fantastic. And I'd be happy to share any of our things, you know, and they can be adapted, I think, to fit different circumstances.
You know, it's a hard one for me because as a director of assessment, I think everybody should have a long-term plan for what you're going to measure and why and how you're going to use the information. And that may be a 5-year plan, it may be a 2-year plan, or it's every 5 years we do Octa, or every 3 years we do Octa, and we use this other thing on an ongoing basis. Depends on what your needs are and for understanding that work. But for me, collaboratory has actually become a tool for me to do my job, not necessarily to answer one single question, because it allows me to then go into, when I need to answer questions, it allows me to do my work. And so sometimes people ask me, well, how much time do you spend doing collaboratory? And I'm like, well, that's really difficult. It comes up in every conversation because it becomes so integrated into just how we think about our work. And so it's very difficult for me to quantify the amount of time spent tracking. You know, it's whenever it needs to be done, meaning, and I see a press release that the university is doing a new thing. It's like I have students at 10 hours a week who I just forward a press release to, and they enter it and follow up with faculty. So it's a weird ongoing part of my day-to-day thinking and job, so that when I literally get, like, I'm leaving to go out of town and somebody says, State Relations wants to know every school we're working with in the state of Indiana, and I can instantly export you by zip code and map it in 10 minutes. And that needs to, and it's live in real time for the most part, right? Like, it's not, hey, well, this is our data from a year ago. Now we still have those things of when I needed it from a year ago, but it also has the most recent up-to-date stuff. So I think they complement each other so well. I don't, to say you don't need one of them, In my perfect world, you do it all of it, right?
Yeah, I think I'm going to piggyback off of what Kristen said. And it fits really nicely in terms of the mobilization cycle anyway. When I talk to people who have used the Okta, and there have now been, I'm going to be conservative and say 8 campuses and communities that have done Okta a second, and there's one that's actually done it a 3rd time. So, I think you always have to ask yourself, where are you in that cycle? And so I think you're always doing something about awareness raising, and you're always doing something about coalition building. And if you've already collected data at some point, you're always doing some interpretation and creating some sort of action-based plan. So I know that may be fairly generic in terms of a response, Sarah, but I do see things that way. And it's really why we promote the continued use of Okta or any other tool that people are using, because it's the idea that there are always these shifting sands that are happening, and you really have to keep taking temperatures to know where you are. And I think that that's an advancement. And I'm really glad that in 2021, we're talking this way, because 10 years ago, I was still trying to convince people that anecdotes, when you add them up together, don't equal data. You just can't take a bunch of stories that you get from the folks that you're in contact with the most and think that you have some understanding. And that cuts both ways. It cuts both in terms of people who may have certain citizens, for instance, who are always in their ear about student partying. And yet, if you're only paying attention to that, you may be missing many other residents who talk about the great cultural things that happen as a result of the campus being there, the economic development opportunities, et cetera. So I'll end with the thought that I think you can't not measure.
Very good. Well, we're running out of time. Any final thoughts, comments, inspirations to give before we sign off? Or final questions from those that are watching?
Well, we should give a plug for Kristen and the collaboratory, because they're up next, right? So if we haven't done that already, let's make sure that the audience knows that we're going to be doing this for the next several months, right?
Yep, I just advanced the next slide. So on Wednesday, July 28th, we're going to continue the Town Gown Turnaround series of ITGA. We're going to continue to have them at noon Eastern time on the last Wednesday of every month. So if you enjoyed hearing about the different tools today, but we just didn't have time to really dive in and assess and analyze how they work or if it's perfect for you, we want to dive in even deeper. This was kind of a quick overview of everything. Next month, July 28th, Kristen is going to have several
I'll go in here. I have several campuses. No, you're totally fine. I have several institutions that are using Collaboratory, and I wanted to invite all of them to talk about how they're actually using it to examine partnerships. And so we have one campus that's using, I know of a colleague who's doing it to convene people in the community. It's been really fun to hear her perspective. She's the one that I would mention that when you actually bring the community partners together to talk about what they're doing, they didn't realize that they were all sort of doing other things. So she'll refer to that experience. Some have used it as a faculty development tool. I have a colleague out in University of Tacoma, but also for Collaboratory, that's done some really great social network analysis to measure the strength of their partnerships through a variety of factors, length of time, funding, teaching, faculty, number of people involved, that sort of thing. And then a very close colleague of mine, Emily Yonke, and Kristen Medlin, and I will talk about some of the work we're doing around place marking as an alternative to benchmarking. I would sort of theoretical framework for thinking about how our institutions are stewards of place.
Coming from the community partner side of things, that's very exciting for me, because I literally had a board member say, we should really get involved with the university more. And I had to kind of take a breath and step back and say, well, we're on 5 different committees and we meet with them at least twice a month, right? And they had no idea. So this is very exciting. Again, thank you to all of you. Kristen will be July. Stephen will come back to talk about Okta in August. And then Sam and Sharon, I hope you'll be back in September to tell us more about the Archway Partnership. thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you who listened. I hope you'll join us again next month and continue to stay involved with ITGA as an organization, but also this Town Gown Turnaround series as we dive into how we can improve our relationships and turn things around for the betterment of universities and our communities. So thank you again. I have been Sara Bloom with the ITGA board. Kristen, Stephen, Sam, Sharon, you have been amazing. Thank you. This recording will be available by Monday, so we'll have that on the itga.org website. We'll also be sending the link out to everyone that registered for today's webinar. Have a wonderful Wednesday, everyone.
Bye, thank you.